I'm going to be talking about the book that Lockdown Life, the Pandemic Experience for Older Diarists, which was published in March to coincide with the 5th anniversary of the first lockdown. I'll start by just saying a little bit about how this project got underway. It was, in fact, Thursday, the 19th of March, 2020, when I woke up, and I think we all knew that there was going to be a lockdown very soon. And I just sort of thought, what am I going to do? I'd quite like to have a project. And I thought back to, I'd recently done a project of 60-somethings, and I thought, well, there will be some people here maybe that might be interested in participating, and lots of other networks and contacts. And at the time, there was some suggestion that it might be possible that the over 70s were going to be treated differently from everyone else. So I thought, well, maybe I'll see if I can do a project of the over 70s. So the next 2 days, I sort of thought exactly what I would do for this project and wrote out little briefings for participants and so on. And by Saturday, I was ready to begin the recruitment. And so I sent out messages to anyone I had and asked them to pass them on to everyone else they could think of. And I was actually overwhelmed by the response, such that by Monday, 2 days later, I was able to start data collection. In my long research career, I've never, ever been able to do anything at this speed. I would have had to, if I was still full-time in university, there'll be lots of committees and so on and so on. Of course, the downside was that it was a project that I had to do by myself, no research assistants or administrative assistants or funding, but still, we had a project. And I like to think of this as a modern day mass observation exercise. As Nick's already said, there's a long and valuable tradition in mass observation, and also given my family connection and my uncle, I was pleased to be able to pay some sort of homage to him. But more generally, it was obvious there was going to be a lot of official view and a lot of people saying exactly what was happening and so on. But again, as Nick has emphasized, it's really important to have people speak for themselves as well. We want to know what they think themselves. And the other important thing is to be able to tell things as it happens. You ask somebody now to reflect back on the pandemic, and they're not going to say the same thing as they said at the time. So in terms of social history, trying to get this sort of perspective is really, really important. So the project began, and it was a focus on written diaries. But it was all quite fun as well. So every week I would send an email round to everyone with anything I could think of that was interesting, but also with some suggestions of things that people might like to write about in their diaries if they wanted to. Sometimes these are things I thought of myself or things relating to what was going on, but they also came out of the responses that I had from the diarists themselves. So, for example, somebody noted that they thought that their pet was acting rather differently during the pandemic. So here was a question: had anyone else got any observations about how animals were reacting? And we also had some challenges. So we had a lockdown recipe challenge. So people sent in their favourite recipes. I collated them all and sent them round. We had a poetry challenge. We had desert island disc books and film challenges. So the whole thing was quite fun, as well as hopefully informative. Just briefly, the sample then was 68 men and women who are recorded in the book. About 2/3 of these were women, all aged over 70. Obviously, people willing to keep a diary for several months. Actually, did I say that on the... Oh, sorry, I forgot to say.
willing to keep a diary for several months, because what I had said to anyone who's going to participate, that I would hope that they would be able to write diary entries, say, at least 3 times a week, and it would last for several months. But I didn't have an end date at that time, because nobody knew what was going to happen. We'd only just started the first lockdown. So this was not a representative sample. It was a fairly middle-class, educated sample of older people, but it is part of the whole jigsaw. There's been a lot of documentation of a lot of deprivation, all sorts of things happening, and these people were the first to admit that they were amongst the most fortunate during the pandemic. When I went into the project, I didn't have any specific hypotheses or anything really, because it was about what the diary said and what occurred to them, what their experiences were in this unprecedented situation. But there were a few things that I thought would be interesting. First of all, how were the diarists going to react to the unprecedented restrictions that were enforced by the pandemic? Living in a Western democratic society, we're not used to being told that we can't go out. We can only go out for an hour. That we can't see our families and our friends and all the other things all the other restrictions that were imposed upon us. This was, absolutely without precedent. And how would people react? As many of their normal activities were curtailed, how would daily lives change? Would other things spring up in their place? What would happen remained to be seen. And then there was the virus. So this virus that nobody really knew much about, really, especially at the beginning. How did you get it? Where was it? Would it sit around on a gatepost if you went through a gate? We knew very, very little about it. So how would people what would they do to try to keep themselves safe? And how would they re-emerge from the pandemic? It's one thing being told, no, you can't do this, and with kind of restrictions, very clear cut. But when you re-emerge, that's up to each individual person as to how they are going to react. Do they feel safe yet by this stage or not? So these were some of the things that I thought were interesting. Plus, of course, if there were any lessons for another occurrence of something similar. The diarists between them wrote almost 1.5 million words. And I was every day, really, I got entries in, and so I read them through. I acknowledged back to the diarist, and I categorized them in an initial form. Then, of course, when at the later stage, I then had to classify them much more by themes and topics, and also in terms of at what stage in the pandemic things had happened, because that made a difference for many kinds of things. And then it was about constructing the story around this whole thing. So in my book, the diary entries, of which unfortunately the vast majority of the diary entries ended up on the cutting room floor, but the entries which I selected are embedded within information on the current events, what was actually happening at the time, mostly related to the pandemic, but of course there were other things as well going on at the time. Various surveys were going on, statistics, we were bombarded with statistics, all these sorts of things. And also a sort of light touch theoretical framework, which are based on the symbolic interactionism, because a lot of what was going on was about symbols. As I say, the virus was intangible. We didn't have a crisis where you could, there was lava spurting all over the place, or you could, there was something really tangible. This was something that we had to understand happened. And how did we understand it? We understood it through interactions with various, with the media, with the environment, and with other people, and through the symbols of the environment around us. Well, there's an awful lot of different things that are in the book. You know, as in Nick's book, there were a lot of topics that were covered. So I'll just give a few, I just pick out a few illustrations, really. So when people did, when they started writing their diaries, I asked everyone also to provide a retrospective entry. So this was about how when they first heard about the COVID, well, it wasn't called COVID then, about the pandemic, and what their first thoughts were, etc., and so on. And it was very apparent that really for almost everybody, although it had been in the news for a while, most people weren't really expecting it to come here and to be serious, and for us all to be locked down. And it really kind of came as a bit of a sharp shock when it really did. So Eve, for example, says, my attitudes have definitely changed since I first heard about the coronavirus, because I was rather sceptical at the beginning about its seriousness. I changed my mind, though, once I saw the figures from Italy and realised how quickly it was spreading and the number of deaths. And Gatsu, the 16th of March was the last time I had an almost normal day. I suddenly realised the seriousness of it all. And this was very true of really almost everyone. Many people who were caught in the middle of holidays, they were in airports, they were the other side of the world, they were all sorts of things. It did come as a bit of a surprise. So as I say, at this stage, certainly, well, for quite some time, it was a symbolic thing. And really right from the very, very beginning, there was a complete change in the environment. You'd look out, the cars were in the garages, the roads were quiet, people weren't out, maybe you could hear a bit more bird song. You could immediately see it. As Anna says, no planes, no vapor trails, blue skies, and bees in the garden. Correction, one vapor trail about 5 p.m. Another great symbol and interaction, not exactly an interaction, but was with the media. And so many people wrote about this absolute love-hate relationship, really, they had with the media and with these 5 o'clock briefings every day. People saying, oh, I absolutely hate them, but I can't stop, I have to watch. And as Fishman says, listened to the radio, decided to ration Radio 4 as suffering coronavirus overload. It appears as nothing else worth reporting in the world. And so many people said this, and these great news reports, and an awful lot of repetition, but it was kind of compulsive, but it didn't really tell you anything. Another very interesting thing I thought was that within this particular group, in this sample, who were very good at keeping themselves away from danger, they lived in spacious homes, they mostly had gardens, they didn't have to go to work or do what they weren't, anything like that, that it took quite some time before they really personally encountered somebody who was ill or who died from the virus. It was very much a vicarious experience. And in fact, only 3 of the diarists were known to have contracted the virus. 2 right at the very, very beginning, even before lockdown and before testing had started. But so it can't be totally confirmed, but they're pretty certain that they did. They were husband and wife, and I think they certainly did have it, and 1 person towards the end. But generally speaking, they kept themselves safe. And so Appletree, talking right in May, she then received a phone call to say the husband of a mutual friend, so even then it's not very direct, had died of coronavirus. He'd been in a care home for maybe 5 years with early onset dementia.
it's beginning to bring the reality close to home. And it really took some time before people were able to actually have some more direct experience of someone who'd been ill and weren't simply relying on these symbols of the crisis. The meaning of time, I thought, was another interesting thing, because obviously this made the restrictions, the having to stay at home, made a tremendous difference. And this group of people were actually very busy people in their normal lives. And the things that were cancellations were vast and varied. Many of them, they were holidays, sporting activities, part-time jobs, hobbies, meetings with friends, theatre trips, or I don't know, all kinds of things. So this made a tremendous difference to their lives. So now they were going to have to stay at home. So early on, a lot of them talked about, what were they going to do, and saying, I mean, there were an awful lot of people who said, right, I'm going to declutter the house completely. Asked later on, they hadn't all achieved it, but it was a question of deciding, how are you going to pass this time? Sky says, I drifted for the first week and then decided I needed a structured program. The thing was that many people found that really every day was very much like one another. You didn't have the same sort of things to demarcate one day from the next. Anna said, what did I do today? It's getting hard to account for time. And what a lot of people did was they tried to resurrect some sort of structure and make sure that weekends were different. Maybe they'd eat something different. Maybe they would put a tablecloth on the table for their evening meal. Perhaps they would wear something different. And when there were bank holidays, there was the same sort of thing. There was different ways in which people tried to reimpose some sort of structure which they had left. Now, time, of course, wasn't only about the present, but it was also about the future. Nobody knew how long this was all going to go on for, and this was I won't use the word elderly, but it was an older sample, and people weren't in the main. There were a few, but they weren't not in the main thinking about going back to work and those sorts of things. So another thing was, well, how long is this going to go on? Am I going to emerge from it? And, in what condition? So there was quite a lot of attention paid to making sure people had got their wills in order, got powers of attorney set up, made sure they threw away all those old love letters they certainly didn't want their children seeing, and just all sorts of preparation and tidying up in terms of the future. 3 new priorities stood out to me as predominant. The first, Zoom, and how many words were written about Zoom, I really cannot say. I think all the diarists were on Zoom for one thing or another, and the list of different activities was absolutely enormous, and people were getting double booked and saying, what a relief, I didn't have any Zoom today. But it was absolute lifesaver, I think, for so many people. It meant people could stay in contact with their friends and families. They could participate in a lot of activities, choirs, all kinds of exercise routines, all kinds of things. A second new priority seemed to be food. Stuck at home, a lot of people did turn much more attention to food. First of all, you had to procure it. So gardens, allotments were important in this context. But a very early priority for very many people was trying to get a delivery, a food delivery, or a click and collect. And the difficulties that people had were quite interesting. And and people exclaiming how ridiculous it was, how excited they were when they actually eventually got a slot. It was a real highlight. And then, of course, cooking, the recipes, but it wasn't all fun. People saying, gosh, I've just cooked however many dinners on the trot, you know. I hope I'm not going to be doing this for the rest of my life. The third priority, which was aided by the fantastic weather that we had during first lockdown, was the natural environment. And people went out and they were, you know, observing perhaps had an app on their phone to sort of identify all these plants, seeing wildlife, watching the swans giving birth to their cygnets, and so on and so forth. But the natural environment, whether in the gardens or in parks or wherever, was another very important thing. It didn't characterize the later lockdowns, but for the first lockdown, it was very important. Keeping the virus at bay, as I mentioned, it was rather intangible and people really didn't know. Masks and social distancing raised lots of stories, and a lot of them really quite humorous. And people talked about it seeming like you're playing a game of chess when you go out walking, with people darting diagonally and round corners, and it was quite a thing. But it was also these other elements, and a bit like the quote that Nick gave. What do you do when that parcel arrives, that book or what other parcel? And people were saying they were leaving the post on the floor for several days, or putting things in the boxes in the garage. Because although they were keeping themselves safe, what were they bringing into their house? Nobody really knew. Did the virus linger on cardboard? Did it linger on metal? And so on and so forth. For some, this was quite scary times. As Jacka says, for 4 weeks we had no other face-to-face contact, with the exception of an open reach engineer. When I met him at the gate, I was at complete loss as to what to do. Wondered if I should hold up a clove of garlic or something. And Clara said, I had 2 food deliveries, good, but stressful. I have to assume everything has the virus on it. To have a system at the front door of emptying fruit and veg from packaging into a bowl and taking packaging and cardboard straight down to recycling. Wearing gloves, wash all fruit and veg. Oranges that have been in netting I even put into bleach and then rinse. It's all scary. I mean, people were very varied in the measures that they took, but you know, people didn't really know. So uncertainty and confusion were certainly the order of the day, and there were so many things that people didn't really know. How long would the pandemic last? Initially, Boris Johnson has said it was going to be a few weeks, but the time kept getting longer and longer. Then lockdown finished. There were still 2 more lockdowns to come, and so on and so forth. How does the virus operate? Well, I've just said about that. What do restrictions actually mean? This was, you know, people. Some things seem to be sort of quite straightforward in a way, like saying, well, 2 meters. Keep 2 meters away, although at one stage it was said, well, if you actually can't do 2 meters, do 1 meter instead. But, you know, people were pragmatic as well, and they did interpret the restrictions for themselves, and there was probably not many people who didn't have some transgression or another at some stage, albeit probably quite minor, and when they felt that, you know, it was perfectly safe to do it. One of the things actually that I found quite amusing was when the bubbles were introduced, and these provided an enormous amount of confusion. Nobody really understood the bubbles, but it was quite
good for many people in a way, because it allowed them to interpret them as they wanted. And one person said, um, today we put our family bubble to the test. Our son, daughter-in-law, grandson, and his mother came to lunch. And also unexpectedly, our daughter-in-law's aunt. So these people were all kind of absorbed into a bubble. And there were lots of examples like this where a wide range of people were included. But restrictions, there were lots of silly examples about restrictions, like, does a Scotch egg count as a meal when you're only allowed to go into a pub if you had a meal? And that generated a lot of discussion. So there were a lot of different things. Other sorts of restriction. Oh yeah, one example, somebody said a lot of people were rather not terribly pleased with police reactions in certain cases. One example from the diarist was somebody who'd been out for her walk and she'd got a stone in her shoe, and she sat down on a bench to remove the stone, and she was told to move on, please. I'm not sure if the please was added, but she was told to move on. Another thing that created uncertainty for a lot of people, maybe uncertainty isn't quite the right word, but a lot of discussion, was the different policies. And being an educated group of respondents, they were really very critical often of the policies and how evidence-based they actually were. And also whose advice was being taken. It was generally a fairly restricted group on the evening briefings, which people commented on. There were things commented perhaps on some of the modelling that was done, which was then almost taken as factual rather than a model, and so on and so forth. So there was quite a lot of criticism of all these sorts of things, and there was very mixed reactions overall, and it has to be said the number of this group did quite enjoy the pandemic in many respects, but there are other people who were extremely anxious, and I think that's a more general thing as to whether there was a climate of fear that was purposefully encouraged. It's not unheard of, and maybe that was the case. What did we learn? Well, I'm not going to go into detail, but I think involvements, these are just some of the conclusions that came out from these diarists. The involvement in the decision-making process, which I just said a bit about, the encouragement of compliance, and so you've got the restrictions. Were these the right restrictions? Was there a climate of fear? All these sorts of things. Did the police act appropriately? The internet is an invaluable resource, and I think that really, really did come through. I think people would have had a much worse experience if they hadn't had Zoom and other ways of communicating with other people. Older people as a neglected resource was another point that came out. There were a lot of respondents who wanted to do much more than they were able to do. They could do things in their community. They could help other people shop. There was a lot of community activity, but a lot wanted to do more. They offered to volunteer and never heard anything more. Some local authority said, "I'm sorry, you're too old, we can't get insurance for you." But I think in another time, much more should be made of them. There was a lot of adaptability, a lot of altruism, and a lot of stoicism that came through from the sample in question. And I think that was important to recognise. And of course, we need to be prepared for next time. I'll just very briefly, 5 years on, because it's quite hard to say generally, and also Nick has said quite a lot about 5 years on. We've still got no official report. I mean, and indeed,
There is debate on whether the official inquiry is asking the right questions. I'm not really up to date with where they've got to at the moment. It doesn't seem to get very much publicity, but you know, I'm not holding my breath on that. Are we any better prepared for a similar event? Well, again, as Nick has said, things, you know, things get passed over. Things that are really important one moment seem to disappear. And, you know, we're overwhelmed by so many issues nationally and internationally at the moment that I should think we might be better prepared in terms of a vaccine and maybe things, but I don't know. Obviously, there's continuing impact from the almost 250,000 deaths that have occurred. They will still be, that will be leaving their mark. And there seems, and again, as Nick has said, there's definitely consequences for working from home, hospital backlogs, maybe long COVID, many more online activities of all kinds of things. Impact on a lasting impact on town centres, pubs, etc., which has been exacerbated by the cost of living crisis and new legislation on taxation, etc. But COVID is probably in there as well. In terms of the 70-somethings, much more anecdotal, and I think really a lot of it depends on individual people. So I've just got 3 quotes here from after the Freedom Day in July 2021, how people reacted to returning to normal. So Jennifer says, when Freedom Day was announced for England, my anxiety level went up a lot. I was waking up in the morning feeling sick and initially wondering what was wrong with me. At that time, we didn't know whether Wales would join the free-for-all. Happily, that did not take place. Gradually, my anxiety level has gone down, but it's still there. So I agree with those who have labelled it Anxiety Day. So there were a lot of people who certainly at that stage were reluctant to go back to their former lives. They weren't sure. There was still confusion. There was still uncertainty. Holgate, by contrast, same time says, life is short and I feel invigorated in the return to daily, weekly, yearly life, with all its high and low spots. While it's been important to remain vigilant and careful, it's been great to travel within the UK, to see friends and family and to reconnect with the lifeblood of life. And Janwig, I behave as if no COVID exists. I've been to pub musics, Ronnie Scott's, Soho Pizza Express for basement jazz. It's been wonderful. People think we're reckless. Maybe we are. All I can say is so far so good. I've drawn the line at abroad though. So I think, you know, individual reactions and those individual reactions are also framed by the, you know, personal health, financial security, family circumstances, social connections. People, you know, are you living alone? Have you got friends? Are you, you know, friends and families to connect with? So I think, as from my only anecdotal evidence, much is back to normal. Holidays, you know, the roads are full, people are going back on leisure activities. People I have met and know about don't seem to still be still having an impact. More community spirit, I wonder. Certainly where I live, COVID definitely spurred more community spirit. We've got many more communal activities. We have a very active WhatsApp group that was set up during the pandemic, and that continues. And that's probably the case in many places, but probably not everywhere. More online activities, definitely, but more exercise and more cooking, well, I don't know about that. I've seen some reports of people moving to the country now having regrets, but that's probably not very widespread. one longer term impact, definitely there is. The pandemic is a very good, useful marker of time, you know, when we have to keep looking back and when did that happen? Oh dear, now was it before COVID or after COVID? And that is a very useful and real longer term impact. So that's all I'm going to say. Unfortunately, my book and with the academic publisher is very expensive, but there is a code also to buy that at half price using the code and this thing. If anybody is interested to buy it, but they haven't managed to get that, if you get my email address and write to me, I'll let you know that this is until the end of June. Anyway, that's it. Thanks.